This final video covering the content from Chapter 2 is going to focus on definitions. That is to say, it's going to focus on the process of giving words their meanings. We're going to look at lots of different types of definitions. In this video, for example, ostensive definitions, verbal extensional definitions, intensional definitions, lexical definitions, stipulative definitions, precising definitions, persuasive definitions, syntactic definitions, and operational definitions. If you don't know what any of those terms mean yet, don't worry about it. That's what we're going to cover. Let's start with ostensive definitions. An ostensive definition occurs when you define something by pointing it out in the real world. So, for example, if someone said to you, "Hey, what's a kangaroo?" and there was a kangaroo nearby and you pointed at it and said, "That thing, that's a kangaroo," that would be providing an ostensive definition. This is the type of thing parents do all the time when teaching their kids new words. If this mom points up and says, "Look, that's an airplane," she's giving her son an ostensive definition of the word airplane. Ostensive definitions are also called non-verbal extensional definitions. There are also verbal extensional definitions. Let's take a step back for a second, though, and define what we mean by the extension of a term. The extension of a term is the set of individuals, objects, or events to which the term can be correctly applied. For example, the extension of dog is the set of all dogs. Verbal extensional definitions select members of a set to which a term applies, but they do so by verbally naming members of the set instead of pointing them out like we do with ostensible definitions. So, for example, if we had the term prize fighter, if we were giving a non-verbal ostensible definition, what we would do is we'd just point at the prize fighters. But let's say there's no prize fighters nearby. Instead, you can try to get someone to understand the term by naming off prize fighters, such as Muhammad Ali, Joe Louis, and Evander Holyfield. Of course, a limit to extensional definitions, either verbal or nonverbal, is that someone might think there's certain traits that are required to fit the definition that aren't actually part of the definition based on the objects that you picked out. In this case, we've picked out all men, so if someone really didn't know what the term prize fighter meant and they were trying to figure it out based on the individuals we selected, they might think that only guys can be prize fighters. You could solve this problem by naming a woman, like Rhonda Luna. But of course, the trick will be finding enough objects to pick out such that the definition is appropriately conveyed. And this will be trickier for some words than others. Next, we've got intensional definitions. The intention of a term, in contrast to its extension, is the set of all and only those properties or characteristics that a thing must possess for that term to apply to it. For example, a person must possess the property of being a professional boxer for the term prize fighter to be correctly applicable. When a term is given an explicit intensional definition, a phrase equivalent in meaning to the term is stated. For example, to say that prize fighter means a professional boxer is to give an explicit intentional definition. There are different types of explicit intentional definitions that can be offered. A first one that we're going to look at is a common one, the lexical definition. Lexical definitions are a type of explicit intentional definition. Lexical definitions are the type of definition typically found in most dictionary entries. The purpose of a lexical definition is to present the accepted standard use of a term. A lexical definition should be neither too narrow nor too broad. That is to say, the definition should state the set of properties possessed by all things to which the term applies, but only to those things. Here's an example of an overly broad lexical definition. Knife means an instrument for cutting. Well, this is too broad because it's going to include things like scissors, which aren't knives. A pair of scissors is an instrument for cutting, but it's not a knife. That makes this definition overly broad. Now here's an example of an overly narrow definition. Table means a piece of furniture consisting of a flat top set horizontally on 4 legs. But what about 3-legged tables? This is clearly a table, but it doesn't satisfy this lexical definition. That's why this definition is too narrow. Of course, sometimes you can manage to have definitions that manage to be too narrow and too broad all at once. Take, for example, cat means domestic animal. Well, on this definition of cat, your chinchilla would count as a cat, which makes it too broad. But at the same time, these cheetahs, who are not domestic animals, would not count as cats, so it's also too narrow. A lexical definition should also not be circular. A circular definition incorporates the term being defined or some variant of that term into the definition. Circular definitions should be avoided because they're unhelpful. For example, you don't learn much with the circular definition of full-time student as a person who is enrolled full-time in school. Okay, the next type of definition we're going to look at is a stipulative definition. As your book understands the term, stipulative definitions are definitions that introduce new words or terms into a language. It should be noted that sometimes stipulative definitions are understood more broadly so as to include what we'll be calling precising definitions in a little bit. But for now, we're going to go with the way your book uses this term, and it's a bit of a more narrow usage. I point that out just in case you run across the term somewhere else, that you'll be aware of what's going on. Stipulative definitions are also typically a type of explicit intentional definition. Stipulation can be used to give old words new meanings as well, such as when the old word friend, which was a noun and still is, was given its new usage as a verb, such as I friended you on Facebook. Stipulative definitions are common as part of the special vocabulary for specific disciplines. For example, a lot of what you're learning in this course is going to be stipulatively defined terms used as part of logic and critical thinking. Okay, another type of explicit intentional definition is a precising definition. A precising definition is a definition which reduces the vagueness of a term. To see how a precising definition can reduce vagueness, take a look at this example. If we define full-time student as a person who devotes a major part of his or her energies to acquiring some type of knowledge or skill through university courses, we will have a vague definition of full-time student. This is because it's not clear what counts exactly as devoting a major part of your energies to acquiring something. Ought a student taking 11 credits count as a full-time student on this definition or not? To address this problem, we can offer a precising definition of a full-time student as a student who is carrying a course load of at least 12 units a semester. Now there is a clear-cut boundary as to who counts as a full-time student and who does not. The next type of definition we're going to look at is a persuasive definition. Persuasive definitions are definitions that are structured in a way that expresses or evokes an attitude such as approval or disapproval toward things referred to by the term. Persuasive definitions can be used as a strategy to convince others of a particular perspective on the word being defined. Take this example of two different definitions for the word democracy. The first one, the persuasive one, defines democracy as the acceptance and practice of the principle of equality of rights, opportunities, and treatment, lack of snobbery. The second one defines democracy as rule by majority. The reason why this first definition is a persuasive definition is because it associates democracy with all sorts of things that we typically approve of, like a lack of snobbery or equality of rights. The latter one is not persuasive because it lacks this normative or evaluatively laden description. Syntactic definitions are definitions for words like prepositions, articles, and conjunctions that do not have extensions or intensions. These definitions are primarily grammatical or syntactic in nature. Syntactic definitions can be explicit by offering synonyms and means also, in addition to, moreover, as well as. Syntactic definitions can also be implicit, as in or is a coordinating conjunction that introduces an alternative. Okay, the last type of definition we're going to look at here is called an operational definition, and this is another type of nonverbal definition. An operational definition specifies a publicly observable and repeatable operation with a specified outcome that determines whether a sentence containing the expression is correctly applicable to a given situation. Operational definitions are important in scientific studies. All right, let's look at some examples of what we mean. Each side of my table is 3 feet long. If we were to give an operational definition for this, we could say that each side of my table is 3 feet long means that when a standard yardstick is lined up with each side of my table, that's the operation of taking the yardstick and lining it up with the leg of the table. The ends of the yardstick coincide with the ends of the table, and that's the outcome, the matching ends. Thus, we have an operational definition, an operation we can engage in, sticking the yardstick up against the sides of the table, and if the length of the yardstick matches the length of the end of the table, each side of the table is 3 feet long. Or, try this one, the flame is blue. That means, according to this operational definition, that when subject to analysis by a spectrometer, the flame registers between 4240 and 4912 angstrom units of wavelength. Or this one, Jordan is afraid of the dark. That means that whenever Jordan is in a dark place, he breaks out in a cold sweat and begins to tremble. Operational definitions are useful in the fact that they can pick out a unified procedure that people can use in order to tell whether or not a certain condition is satisfied, but they've also got their limits. One, for example, might think that what Jordan is afraid in the dark means is something completely different than the fact that he breaks out in a cold sweat and begins to tremble. Those are merely indicators that he is in fact afraid of the dark. The last topic we're going to cover before closing is use versus mention. Sometimes when talking about things like words and definitions, people can get tripped up if they don't pay attention to the difference between when words are used versus when they are merely mentioned. The difference between use and mention can be made clear if we look at the following little example. Take this. Puppies has 7 letters. And this claim. Puppies are fun and playful. This is a claim about the word. The animals aren't comprised of letters, but the word is. And since we're talking about the word and not what the word refers to, here we are merely mentioning puppies. Down here, where we say puppies are fun and playful, this is not a description of the word itself. This is a description of the objects picked out by the word puppies. So this is an example of the term puppies being used and not just mentioned. It is standard practice for words being mentioned and not used to be italicized, put in quotation marks, or to be put in scare quotes, that is, the single quote marks. Thus, this is why puppies has 7 letters on top when it's merely being mentioned is in quote marks, and puppies are fun and playful when it's referring to the actual animals does not have any kind of marking around it. All right, that's all we have for Chapter 2. Chapter 3, you're next.